It's Professor Richardson here. I'm making this little YouTube video to accompany the online web unit I have about supply chain management to put some things in the context of management information systems and international business. So as you can see, international business and MIS influence supply chain in a number of different ways. The first thing I wanted to mention at the very beginning of this is that the supply chain is affected by a number of things, particularly the 6 environments. The first point I have here is the political, legal, regulatory environment. Import restrictions and tariffs are an example of how a supply chain could be affected if the politics in one country are such that in order to protect its workers from being unemployed, it increases incoming tariffs on something, then that will make it more difficult for companies that want to import a product affected by that in order to make that manufactured good. Topographical barriers refers to mountains, flat land. Also, the geographical environment includes things such as weather and climatic extremes like a volcano in Iceland or a hurricane in the Caribbean. The economic environment, presently, as I'm making this video today, January 18th, 2011, the Canadian dollar is a cent above par, which is very good if you want to buy things from the United States, but if you want to export to the United States, it's somewhat challenging. Technological environment also affects supply chain in terms of versions, particularly when you're talking about IT products and services, and also the matching of component parts and the differences between electronics in Asia, North America, and Europe, even things such as the cords to plug them into the wall, and also document processing requirements. The competitive environment is perhaps the most important of all of these, because when you have an intense competitive environment, you have to pay attention to all of these points quite particularly. When you do not have an intense competitive environment, like BlackBerry in the very beginning when there were no other similar type of devices, you could do whatever you want. But when other people start to knock off your product and make somewhat similar products, then you have to be very attentive to all these points. The other thing that's also a part of supply chain management is how the 4 P's influence the consequence for what you could subsequently make. For example, if you're talking about something in terms of the features or colors or shape of a product, this depends on your source of supply for materials. If you're producing, in the case of say notebook computers, and you're going to do a run of say 20,000, but you can only find companies that make battery packs in groups of 500, 700, 800 here. You may not necessarily have the exact same supplier of batteries for the notebook computer for the entire production run of that model. You may get the specific details to match very, very closely, but when 3 owners open up the back of their Toshiba notebook and all find that they've got 3 different types of battery packs inside, it could be somewhat disconcerting. Price. The price that you sell your final product at is going to be depending upon the supply of the component parts. Promotion. Some of the times people can sell things based upon the component parts. For example, I predict in 2012 a number of handset designers will talk about how their cameras in their cell phones have a higher degree of pixelization. For example, Sony presently is boasting that they've got a 10 megapixel camera. Most cell phones and Blackberries right now only have a 3 megapixel camera, but once you go up to 10, it changes quite dramatically the quality of the pictures that you could take. And so that would be one of the things that you would use in your promotional material. Place. The region where a company assembles this product and where it gets its product from is also an influencer on the subsequent things that you're able to produce. So let's look at some definitions for what is a supply chain. If you go to supplychain.org, which is a large portal where companies support that dealing with supply chain, it talks about it in an international context, and I've made a couple of points here. Basically, the things you do involved in producing and delivering a final product or service. That's one of the sort of the standard terms. The textbook that we use in C11 talks about supply chain management in terms of planning, implementing, controlling to increase efficiency. And in terms of controlling, you're controlling the raw materials, the work in progress inventory, and the finished goods. Let's just look at a couple of those points. The movement and storage of the raw materials. That's always a risky thing, because whenever you transport something a far distance, you've got risk of threat from the geographic environment. You've also got risk of theft. You've also got risk in transportation. The transportation systems may break down. The work in progress inventory, that's necessary because if something happens, you decide to change the version of the product, or particular model changes, some of the things that you are halfway finished may not end up being completed. Can you sell them? Yes, you can. If it's an IT product, you could sell the component parts to another company who could finish them. The Center for Research in Electronic Commerce also talks about supply chain management. It talks about a couple of points related to the coordination of order generation, order taking, fulfillment, and distribution. This is sort of looking at supply chain management in terms of buying things off the web. And the coordination of order generation goes back to somebody clicking on something on the website that they want to select, which in turn then causes the company to make certain selections among their component parts to make that particular product. The people that are involved are on several different levels. You've got the suppliers, which I'll discuss in a few minutes, are on 3 different levels. You've also got the people shipping, the wholesalers, and the retailers. So a global manufacturing supply chain management circumstance would look like this. You'd have the coordination of the materials, you'd have information and the money to go along with it. So let's break it out into a more expanded explanation. When we talk about the coordination of materials, you got when they arrive, their location, the warehousing and storage. This is important in order to facilitate production in an efficient way. They also have to be packaged if they're delicate, particularly IT components and parts, and depending on the geographic environment and weather extremes in particular areas. We also have to deal with information about the materials. You've got dimensions, quality, quantity, that the number of materials of the right quantity are in a particular location, and price fluctuations. Particularly when you're dealing with electronic products that have component parts from literally all over the world from their specialty factories, you have to factor in currency exchange rate fluctuations of up to 3, 4, 5 different currencies. And of course you've also got the monetary considerations where you're borrowing money from the bank to pay for all of this circumstance. So this is a bit of an expanded definition of what I was talking about the suppliers when I said they're broken down in 3 categories. The third tier suppliers are the people that make the original raw materials, the people that make the aluminum ingots from which you get the aluminum sheet, which is then pounded out to make the aluminum casings. Second tier suppliers are those that make subcomponents. For example, if you're talking about an overhead projector, which is the example I'm using here, the overhead projector would be assembled by a company using component parts. One of the parts would be a cooling fan assembly. That overhead projector company wouldn't be making the cooling fan assembly themselves. They would buy it from a company that specialized in making cooling fans. That company in turn would buy the motor. The motor would be a copper wire wrapped around 2 magnets on a pole. You may or may not know that when you provide electric current between 2 magnets and a copper wire on an axle, it will rotate. That's the principle of electrical motors, and one of the reasons why China is importing more copper than anybody else around the world, because for all the little electric motors for all types of products that come out of China. The original supplier would be the company that, well, actually you could even go to the 4th level. The 4th level would be the petroleum company in the Middle East or northern Alberta with the tar sands providing the raw oil. The 3rd tier supplier would be taking that oil and turning it into plastic pellets. Plastic, in order to move it around the world, is most easily accommodated when you put it into tiny little balls that can load into railroad cars. Then when you want to make your plastic product, you heat that, and then you let the liquid drain into a mold, and then that takes the plastic shape. Now you could also read further in this section about supply chain management in the context of some purchasing activities and logistics activities, and this gets into more information further down here about logistics activities. Now, the other thing I also wanted to mention at the bottom of the page here is in the context of e-commerce, which would relate also to some things in C11. Planning systems. Planning systems, as it says here, means having the right product at the right place at the right time, which means you have to have good information from the customer. So you have to integrate in electronic different structures with the customer, and we can talk about this in class in more detail. Demand forecasting, using different software models to be able to determine when and where things are needed, because you don't want to buy things in advance, because that means unnecessarily borrowing money from the bank. You don't want to not have things when it's required, because that means you have to halt your production process, which affects your cost of labor. The execution systems, again, are these things facilitating the physical movement of the goods and the need to create cross-functional integration. Performance measurement is also very important, because when you're doing these things, you need to know how are you successful and not successful, so that decisions can be made to change, especially in a very intense competitive environment. And of course, the whole point is to integrate this. The integration of information about demand, where the goods are, the manufacturing, and also the money. Now, what I did at the very bottom was add some examples. One example was Loblaws in 2005. And this is a little story talking about how Loblaws was affected by the supply chain management problems, and had a very difficult situation with warehouses and jobs and so on. So what was the reason for Loblaws dealing with these situations? The answer is Walmart. Walmart has been very, very competitive at cutting costs, but also in its supply chain structure. And some Canadian companies like Loblaws have been looking at this in terms of how they can better manage the supply chain management issues. So 2008 is another story about how Walmart caused Loblaws to be very attentive to upgrading the supply chain situation. And here's an example of this little graphic showing how they've been able to reduce the days in which they're moving their fresh goods from the supplier to the store from 26 to 13 days in total.